Okay, welcome back. This is chapter 4. This is video number 2. So we're talking about gender and sex. In the previous video, we talked about sexual identity, gender roles. We talked a little bit about the biology of the body as it develops, primary and secondary sex characteristics. And then we talked about the influence of hormones during pregnancy and menstrual cycle, and also some of the main masculine or feminine hormones that are released into the body. So next we're going to start talking about the sexual response cycle. And two of the biggest influencers for the development of this sexual response cycle are Williams Masters and Virginia Johnson. In the 60s, they conducted experiments to try to understand the physiological reactions during sexual intercourse. And the purpose was to record the body's physiological response and see if there was a universality between other individuals during this time. So Williams, Masters and Johnson also have a TV show, I think it's on Showtimes, that tends to go through a lot of their experiments and identify their findings. And it's an interesting watch for sure. So now imagine that you were brought in, you were asked to come in and have sex with an individual, and you had numerous scientists that were looming over you with clipboards, and you had countless wires that were connected to you trying to catch your breathing rates, look at like the way your muscles expanded, understand your eyes dilating, and understanding your blood pressure. It's probably the least sexy thing that you can imagine, but that's what they did, and they did it with over 100 individuals. Some of them that were in groups, some of them that were in couples, some of them were individual, just by themselves. A lot of their requirements were very limited to they had to be of legal age, they had to have had sex before, and they had to have had an orgasm before. So when developing this, they were looking at these particular individuals. And I think it's important to remind individuals that this particular step-by-step process, this sexual response cycle, doesn't always mean that everyone follows this. Not everyone follows this particular pattern. Some males may not hit certain levels, and some females may not actually achieve a particular level either. So even though it's saying in here that these levels are step 1, step 2, step 3, it's important to understand that everyone is different, that there are differences between everyone's sexual, biological response cycle. The first stage is called excitement or desire. And this is generally going to last a few minutes at the beginning of this sexual activity. So this is going to be defined by muscles tensing up, heart rate starts to quicken, and breathing is starting to accelerate. The skin becomes more flushed. The nipples become hardened and erect. Blood starts to flow to the genitals, so it increases the swelling of a woman's clitoris and the erection of a man's penis. Vaginal lubrication begins, and we start to see the man's testes start to swell and the scrotum tighten. Number 2, phase 2, is referred to as plateau. So plateau is going to be when a lot of the changes that begin in phase 1 are intensified. So the vagina continues to swell, the woman's clitoris becomes highly sensitive, the man's testicles are withdrawn up into the scrotum, breathing, heart rate, blood pressure, these all continue to increase. Muscle spasms may begin to be felt in the body, and there tends to be an overall tension in the muscles that tends to increase. The third phase is called orgasm. So orgasm is the climax of sexual response cycle. It's the shortest in the phases, and it generally lasts for only a few seconds. A lot of the characteristics are involuntary muscle contractions, blood pressure, heart rate, and breathing at their highest rates. Muscles start to spasm. You start to see in women, the muscles of the vagina start to contract, and the uterus undergoes rhythmic contractions, which help with fertilization. In men, you start to see those rhythmic contractions as well in the base of the penis as a result of ejaculation of semen. And there tends to be a sense of releasing of sexual pent-up energy. The last stage is called resolution, and it's during this phase that the body slowly returns to its normal levels of functioning. The swelled and erect body parts tend to return to their previous size and color, and the phase is usually marked by a general sense of well-being and often fatigued. There is what's referred to as a refractory period, in which it becomes harder for individuals to achieve that response cycle again after or as quick or as fast as they normally would be able to. But it differs between men and women. Typically, men need recovery time after an orgasm. So this can be a duration of maybe a couple minutes to even a day. But for women, it's a lot faster, a lot shorter of a refractory period in which they can go through this response cycle again at a faster rate. Now, there are also sexual dysfunctions that I wanted to talk about a little bit as well. So, we have sexual dysfunctions, which are difficulties in having sex. So, it might be erectile disorders, or premature ejaculation, or even pain or female orgasmic disorder. Now, a lot of these are going to be based upon the problems that consistently impair sexual arousal or functioning. We also have paraphilias, and this is trouble with an individual's sexual interests. It can stem from a distress from unusual sexual interests, which may entail harm or risk to others. Some of the previous dysfunctions that I mentioned, so erectile disorder, an inability to develop or maintain an erection due to insufficient blood flow to the penis, premature ejaculation, reaching a sexual climax before the man or his partner wishes, and a female orgasmic disorder or distress due to infrequent or not experiencing orgasm, or also pain during intercourse. So your textbook has a lot more information on sexual dysfunctions if you'd like to read up on it. Next thing we wanted to talk about was sexual transmitted infections. Not so much defining a lot of these infections, but talking a little bit about the statistics associated with who usually is going to acquire certain infections. A lot of the variables that your textbook talks about are alcohol and drug use that contribute to it, sex, both the act and birth sex, with females typically acquiring more STIs than males. One of the statistics in your textbook talks about 14 to 19-year-old females, around 39% of them have had an STI. Lack of education and age can both be contributing factors, but it's important to remember that correlation does not mean causation. Just because these particular groups are more inclined or they have more data associated with them, it doesn't mean that those are the only variables that relate towards individuals who are more at risk at STIs. So, in talking about sexual interest and transitioning into the psychology of sex, there is a lot of research on testosterone levels and sexual interest, showing a direct correlation between the two. For boys, if they are castrated at an early age, it generally decreases sexual interest and activity later on. We've also found that low testosterone is not the typical reason for impotence. It's usually blood circulation that tends to cause that. But sexual interest can be stemmed from two different categories. The first is external stimuli. So external stimuli, often people will need newer and hotter things to become excited about if they are constantly bombarded with stimuli that is sexually charged. And it's one of the reasons that, oftentimes advertisement companies will say that sex sells. It's because it's captivating and it drives us our primal desires, our biological drives. However, individuals who are constantly watching or constantly hearing of sexual stimuli, they can become habituated. Remember, habituation is that decreased sensitivity towards the same type of stimuli, to the point where individuals might have to change their particular interest, or they may even devalue partners or actual individuals in favor of maybe something on TV or on the internet. It can also alter our perspectives about what is common or what is real. I remember Carl's Jr. used to have these commercials of supermodels who were always cleaning cars and then eating a cheeseburger afterwards. It made no sense at all, but it can create an alter perspective for individuals to believe that it's more common than it actually is. And that can be very harmful for individuals for their external stimuli associated with what they find to be arousing. Just like there's external stimuli, there's also internal stimuli. This can be fantasies, arousal, and desire associated with them. Even individuals with spinal cord injuries with no genital sensitization still have sexual desires. And around 95% of both men and women have sexual fantasies. For women, it tends to be more intimate and personal. For men, it tends to be more physical and less romantic across different cultures. For imagined stimuli, these are sexual desires that and arousal that are imagined. So we tend to see a lot of media that is um, often consumed that tends to have a lot of images and a lot of video of different type of stimuli. But it's oftentimes these imagined stimuli that invoke a lot of those sexual fantasies or sexual desires. And oftentimes, the idea of where this material comes from is going to impact a lot of that imagined stimuli as well. Okay, so this is going to be the next activity, and what I want you to do is I want you to consider what are the mating strategies for men and women. So, mating strategy would be, who do they pick for a mate? Who do they desire for a mate? Do they desire to stay in a committed relationship, or are they more inclined to consider multiple partners? And then how do they consider who their partner is going to be? I want you to think about it for men and women, and I want you to tell me how it might differ between the two and what can explain them. There are two things that I want you to consider when explaining them. I want you to look at it from an evolutionary perspective, so trying to understand why we evolved to have these particular mating strategies. And I want you to consider it from a cultural perspective. What culture has to say about particular mating strategies? So this will be the next activity that you'll turn in. So another pioneer in understanding sex and gender was Alfred Kinsey. And Alfred Kinsey actually came around before Masters and Johnson. He was interested in the sexual behaviors of males and females, and also sexual orientation and desire for people. So his main question was to see what people are doing and what they're willing to admit versus what their fantasies are. He's often regarded as the first major figure in American sexology, and his research is cited as having paved the way for a deeper exploration in sexuality from the general public. Often, a lot of his writings have often been discussed as liberating female sexuality, because before this time, there were notions that women generally were not sexual and didn't desire sex. Kinsey helped explain the female orgasm, experiences vaginally, and discussing about the clitoris and its influence in orgasm. He also developed what's referred to as the Kinsey scale, which is a range from 0 to 6, in which we look into sexual orientation based upon heterosexuality to homosexuality and a spectrum in between. Kinsey published two books, Sexual Behavior in the Human Male, which was published in 1948, and Sexual Behavior in the Human Female in 1953. And both reached top bestseller list and turned Kinsey into a celebrity in sexology. So let's talk a little bit about sexual orientation now. Your textbook concentrates on 3 different sexual orientations. There are many more, but these are the ones that we're going to talk about. So we have homosexuality, which is an interest in members of one's own sex. We have heterosexuality, which is an interest in the other sex, and then bisexuality, which is interest in both sexes. And sexual orientation itself is defined as an enduring sexual attraction towards members of either one's own sex, the other sex, or both sexes. Now, when we consider how someone develops a particular sexual interest, sexual orientation, it's a loaded question because there's a lot of variables that come from within an individual and how they grow. But one thing that the APA, or the American Psychological Association, will often indicate is that it's kind of like left-handed versus right-handed, in saying that there's a greater population of heterosexual individuals in the world, which more right-handed individuals, but there are people that are born left-handed as well. Similarly, the APA's official stance is that sexual orientation is not something we choose and cannot change, and something that individuals are born with. So similar to left-handed individuals, a lot smaller population, but also something that people are born with. And some people are born ambidextrous. So this enduring sexual attraction towards members of one's own sex, other sex, or both sexes. While heterosexuality tends to prevail across cultures in the amount of heterosexual individuals, bisexuality and homosexuality exist in all cultures. Cultures vary widely in social norms or acceptable partners, and efforts to change sexual orientation are oftentimes viewed as unsuccessful and can involve risk or harm for the individual, leading towards denial of feelings, poor self-esteem, feelings of anxiety and depression, and sometimes suicidal tendencies. It's one of the reasons that the American Psychological Association views sexuality as not something we can choose and cannot change. There was a time in the early editions of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders in which psychologists considered heterosexual individuals as having a mental disorder. But the 3rd edition that came out in the early 1970s actually took that out and viewed it not as a mental disorder itself, but as something that individuals are born with. Now, in considering the idea that homosexuality occurs in different cultures, it also occurs in many animal species. So for men often discover sexual orientation early on in life, while the process is a little slower for women in occurring. So when we start looking into behaviors early in childhood, it can be a little more difficult to discover whether the behavior is going to correlate with sexual orientation for girls. Feminine type behaviors during early childhood and adolescence tend to correlate strongly with homosexuality in males, while masculine type behaviors in girls tends to be a poor predictor for sexual orientation. Now, one of the things that the Kinsey Institute in Indiana often asked individuals to try and come up with what were the influences for sexual orientation is they often asked a lot of these questions about environmental influences versus innate influences or biological influences. So they looked at things like homosexuality that's linked towards problems with relationships with parents, homosexuality that involves fear or hatred of other people, sexual orientation linked with sex hormones in the blood. And as children, are homosexuals molested, seduced, or otherwise sexually victimized? They interviewed around 1,000 homosexuals and 500 heterosexuals, and they found that it was no to all of the above. Neither was more likely to have a higher environmental factor as to what their sexual orientation was. So if it wasn't environmental, then there must be biological influences. For this, we see a lot of different variations. So we start to see homosexuality in other species. We even see gay straight brain differences. One particular study looked into understanding how the scent of other partners can be something that can be acquired pretty predictably based upon one's sexual orientation. So homosexuals were put into different groups in which they were to smell T-shirts in which other individuals had worked out in to indicate if they would be attracted to them. Similarly, heterosexuals were. And overwhelmingly, they found that individuals, just based upon the scent or the pheromones of other partners, were able to indicate pretty correctly whether someone was male or female. We also use genetics to help identify a lot of the similarities and differences for sexual orientation. Twin studies is a great indicator because it gives us an idea of what is biological and what is environmental. And there also tends to be prenatal hormone influences as well. One such study looks into the birth order of males, of boys for a mother, indicating that there's a much larger likelihood that males that are born after other brothers tend to have a higher correlation of being homosexual themselves. And that could be due towards the mother's own antibodies that tend to rearrange the hormones for the child in utero. So, to end, talking about why we have sex, kind of bringing it back towards the beginning when we talked about the importance of this word and how massive this word tends to influence a lot of our decisions. We can look at it from a biological, psychological, and sociocultural influence. For biological, we have sexual maturity, the primary and secondary sex characteristics associated with puberty. We see sex hormones that influence, like testosterone, influencing our sexual interest. We have psychological influences such as exposing to external and internal stimuli, and even sociocultural influences such as culture and religion and societal values and family and media that are constantly influencing our own desires, how they relate towards our own interest. So, I think that, let's see. Yep, so why we have sex. Oftentimes, sexual intimacy serves many of life's basic purposes, whether it's procreation, stress reduction, maintaining healthy relationships, social bonding, expression of love, overall fulfillment, and many, many more that you probably considered at the beginning of this. So that's it. What we covered in this chapter was prenatal sex development in relation towards hormones and that last sex chromosome. We talked about primary and secondary sex characteristics, discussing gender roles and how culture influences them, how we learn to be male or female. We talked about sex hormones, sexual response cycle, dysfunctions and paraphilia, and sexual orientation. So remember to turn in both of those activities in Canvas, and I will see you all for next chapter.